Hello, welcome to Connie Martinson Talks Books. My guest Gore Vidal has entitled his new novel, his historical novel, Hollywood. But it's not Hollywood in the 50s, 60s, or 70s as you might think. It's Hollywood in the 1920s. It's Hollywood as propaganda. It's Hollywood learning that that screen in a dark room can influence more people than all the words. Well, the book is published by Random House, and we'll be back after a short pause with Gore Vidal.
After this joyride, I'm out of the crash dummy business for good.
But Vince, it's a great job. Heck, they'd have to pry me away from it.
Anybody home? Larry, they do pry you away from it.
Oh, yeah.
For years, I've been eating steering wheels. For what?
To prove how safety belts save lives.
But thousands die every year in car accidents because they don't buckle up.
Vince, we're dummies. We don't wear safety belts.
Larry, you really know how to hurt a guy. Hit it!
You could learn a lot from a dummy. Buckle your safety belt.
My favorite thing to do is to rock and roll. When I first found out that I had diabetes, I thought it was the end of the world. Turned out it wasn't. Before I go on stage with Dow Jones, I take 2 minutes to monitor my blood sugar. The test tells me if my blood sugar is high or low. Testing my blood sugar helps me keep on doing what I want to do. Hey, if you have diabetes, don't let it stop you. You can achieve anything you go after.
Welcome back. We're talking with Gore Vidal, author of Hollywood, published by Random House. And it's a novel of America in the 1920s. Welcome, Gore.
See you again, Connie.
And it is interesting to see you reading this book and knowing that the men you talk about who are presidents, Woodrow Wilson, Harding, are all on the side, have their mistresses or illegitimate children, and they are sending a man named Will Hayes to make Hollywood a better moral place for the rest of America.
Well, of course, that came in the 20s, which I deal with a little bit in Hollywood, when first the Fatty Arbuckle scandal broke, which was a bum rap for him, by the way. He was not guilty of murdering, or rather harming, that girl who then died of peritonitis, but it was a big, big Roman circus, and suddenly Hollywood was on the edge. Then came the murder, which I go into some detail with, of the director, William Desmond Taylor, a murder that involved, oh my God, everything from homosexuality and drugs, and he was in all of that, but I think it was the mother of Mary Miles Minter, a star of the period, a would-be Mary Pickford. It was her mother who was in love with him, not herself, and somehow or other he got himself murdered. So Will Hayes was really picked by the politicians to go out and clean up Hollywood, but it really came from Hollywood. They were terrified. Between Fatty Arbuckle and William Desmond Taylor, they were terrified of being banned. I mean, there were all sorts of church groups, if you remember. They had just banned alcohol, the prohibition of alcohol, and suddenly you saw there were people talking about prohibition of movies. Because the people in the movies were so scandalous, and they were portraying a way of life which was not an American way of life. So Hollywood, all the motion picture producers got together and said, send us one of your presidential candidates, the Postmaster General of the United States, Mr. Will Hayes, with the big Mickey Mouse ears. And I end the book with that, but before that, there's a great deal going on.
Before that, it begins with Caroline and her brother Blaze. Mm-hmm. Co-owners of the largest newspaper in Washington, on a peer level with William Randolph Hearst, who, as a lark, puts Caroline in a home movie, so to speak, and she falls in love with being a movie star. Well,
it's really, with that and with being, with the movies themselves, it's a very curious thing that Hearst is always first. It rhymes even in these things. When I did Empire, I suddenly realized that at the center, that was 1898 to 1907, that suddenly, although it's the story of Theodore Roosevelt and the American Empire taking off, that the thing is really the story of William Randolph Hearst and his newspapers inventing the news. And he was calling the news, then he calls it, what I say is news. I can tell you a story and it becomes a fact because I print it in a paper. And that will eventually become history. Now we're a few years later, and Caroline, who is imaginary character. She crops up again. There's Hearst, still around. Hearst has figured out the movies. Here's a man with, I think, an IQ of about room level in a rather cool house, yet his instincts were extraordinary. In 1913, about 4 years before my story begins, he put up a lot of money and he did something called The Perils of Pauline, which was the most successful movie serial ever done as of that time. He knew that was going to be it, but he was so busy running for president out of New York and having an affair with Marion Davies, who was about 20 years old then. So I have him in the book sort of tell Caroline, his fellow publisher, she's aged 40 and is feeling at loose ends and not obsessed, as we were talking before. And he said, you know, Hollywood is where it's all going to be. And she didn't know what he meant. I mean, these funny pictures, silent pictures. And then she goes out. She becomes a movie star, and they say, oh, how impractical. Everybody now thinks to be a movie star, you have to be on the stage, you have to be discovered, you have to have something. They just made movies. Yeah. And sometimes you clicked if you had a face that worked, and sometimes you didn't. She clicks.
The camera either loves you or doesn't, and it loves her under the name of Emma Traxler, which is her mother's name. And what is interesting that you bring out is that those who really know her never identify her with that Emma Traxler they're seeing on the screen. Those who don't say, oh, hello, how are you? But the politics of this time, Gore, your grandfather was there. We have talked about how you used to read to him as a little boy. You were there barefoot and God knows what, running through the Senate. He was a blind senator from Oklahoma. The people who were there at the time, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who never gets over almost like being the daughter of a head of a movie studio. And poor Nick, I never knew he was from where, Ohio?
Ohio, yeah.
And he's got to play second fiddle to a man named W.G. Harding and his wife, the Duchess.
He also plays second fiddle to Senator William E. Borah, by whom Alice Longworth had a child. Their daughter, officially, was actually Senator Borah's daughter. I was brought up in Washington with the daughter, really, and also with Alice Longworth and that whole group. And then there was Warren Harding. Everybody quite liked Warren Harding, but nobody knew what he was all about. He was a very handsome man with a very ambitious wife. Didn't know very much, but made a great presence. And the combination was not unlike Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Reagan, who recently lived in the White House. You know, he was kind of never quite there, and she was very much there. Except, I don't know about the Reagans, but the Hardings, that he really was rather shrewd, and he was a very nice man.
I knew very little. I have to confess, my knowledge of American history sort of ended where he came in and then jumps in at when Calvin Coolidge comes back in because he was from Massachusetts. But Harding was always an enigma, just one of those people passing through. He's far more than that in your book. He's much more even likable than poor old Woodrow Wilson. Oh,
well, everybody was more likable than Woodrow Wilson, who was a very cold man, rather a very brilliant man. No, Harding, I think, was, he was quite ambitious. He always said, you know, it's a good thing I wasn't born a woman. He said, I'd be pregnant all the time. He couldn't say no to his friends, and his friends finally betrayed him. And when he died, mysteriously in 1923, after a trip, swing around the circle, they called it, he went around the country. The administration was falling apart, a lot of corruption, though only a fraction of what we've been through in the last 20 years. I mean, corruption in those days was so small.
Well, but we're
one bribe, one present to the Secretary of the Interior was enough to bring down, or would have brought down the administration had Harding not died. That stuff goes on all the time.
What about, we're going to take a short pause, Gore. When we come back, we're going to talk about the leasing of Navy oil fields that really should have been part of the interior.
Which may sound to you like a boring subject, but when Connie and I finish with those oil fields,
you're going to know about
the
Teapot Dome scandal that will follow. We'll be back with Gore Vidal, author of Hollywood, published by Random House.
When we look back in time, as the world reached its darkest hours, people began to provide the light. Well, history is repeating itself. This time in the battle against AIDS, a devastating disease which is claiming more and more lives every year. However, in the midst of this tragedy, there is beauty. as thousands band together to help fight AIDS. After all, AIDS is a disease of the human race. AIDS. Fight the fear with the facts.
Mommy, you're smoking. Did you know that smoking is associated with strokes in women who take the pill?
Uh-huh.
And that pregnant women who smoke have smaller babies?
Uh-huh.
And that women who smoke are 6 times more likely to contract cervical cancer?
Uh-huh. Are you trying to tell me something?
Yeah, kiss your butt goodbye.
Call the American Lung Association at 800-824-7888, operator 535, and kiss your butt goodbye.
Welcome back. We're talking with Gore Vidal, author of Hollywood, published by Random House. Gore, the last time we spoke about Lincoln, he, during Civil War, abnegated on habeas corpus. We come to World War I and Woodrow Wilson and the Espionage Act. It's as if whenever there is war, and we are fighting the good democratic fight, somehow our presidents have lèse-majesty.
Well, that has always happened. That happens in every country, but it gets more vivid in ours because we have the Bill of Rights and we're supposed to have certain inalienable rights like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. We are very quick to sacrifice these rights when we go to war. Lincoln's war was really a rough one, and I think in general you could let him off the hook of being too much the dictator, although he did eliminate habeas corpus at one point in certain sections of the United States. It means there's no due process of law, which our Constitution is based on. I throw you in prison because I think you might be a Confederate sympathizer. When I get to Hollywood, what happens there is the First World War starts in 1917. The country panics. We start demonizing all Germans, which is done through Hollywood itself, with Washington pushing the movie studios into doing movies like The Huns from Hell, because most of the United States was anti-Ally. It was pro-German and pro what they call the Central Powers. Now, how do you get the United States in on the side when we have a huge German population, which still likes the old country, and a huge Irish population which hates England? Now, how are we going to get us in on England's side? Well, it was the trick of the week, and it took a lot of publicity, and it took a lot of subliminal working on the American people to make them hate the Germans. Along with that, the government felt they needed special rights if anybody criticized them for some of the awful things they were doing. So they came up with an Espionage Act, I call it the Alien Sedition Act. Any foreigner could be shipped out of the country by the Secretary of Labor. It was terrible stuff. J. Edgar Hoover got his start at this time. And then they went immediately hunting for Bolsheviks after the Russian Revolution. Every trade unionist in the United States was considered to be a communist spy, so they spied on them. And it was a terrible time, as well as a very corrupt time. Wilson's a very peculiar figure because he's divided. He sees what he's doing and goes right ahead and does it. You know, I have a couple of speeches in there for Woodrow Wilson, which are indeed his own speeches, they're not mine, where he just sits there and says, I don't know what's ever going to happen to the American people if they decide that they're going to go to war and they're going to start conquering the world and take their place as just another big bullying power in the world. How are they ever going to get back to be themselves again? How can we do this? And he didn't see any way back. Well, we did get back, barely, in around 1925. Then the Second World War, and we've never got back. We've been at war ever since 1945. So it's full of, perceptions of this sort that these people had at that time about what kind of country we were.
Fascinating, too, because the parallel with today of the reunification of Germany and also within this book, Germany after World War I. The fact that this is now, there will be no League of Nations because Woodrow Wilson is really in the wrong party. There's a man named Henry Cabot Lodge who says, no way.
That was a sheer partisan bitterness. They wanted to get at Woodrow Wilson. And he wanted the League of Nations, and they said, yes, we want a League of Nations, it's a good idea, but we don't want your league. Well, that was the only one that was being offered to anybody. So Wilson starts out, and my grandfather, who was in the Senate, was a Democrat, and was twice responsible, as he always claimed, for making Woodrow Wilson president in 1912 and again in 1916. My grandfather ran the Wilson campaign and couldn't stand him. So my grandfather, as a Democrat, his own party turned against him, led by my poor old grandfather, who I think was quite wrong politically, but anyway, that's what he did. So Wilson, this dying man, though he didn't know it, has to take this sweep across the country to try and persuade the people. And through the newsreels, which had just come in, they were using everything, all the Hollywood devices, including, they didn't have microphones. Can you imagine? You'd have 10,000 people, and there's no way to project your voice. So they used to have a sounding board behind you. So if you stood, but you had to stand on a little X, and if you strayed away, your voice went. So you'd stand there, and that would project the voice. Finally, when he came here to L.A., he spoke at downtown at the Shriners, and they had a new thing, a microphone. And Wilson is fussing with it. He said, I don't know what it is. Well, think of it, it's like a telephone. He said, well, it's not a telephone. Well, whatever it is, don't get too far from it. And Wilson was one of those speakers who liked to walk here, and he liked to walk there. So he just stood there, getting ready to have a stroke, which he had 2 weeks later, largely due to speaking at the Shriners. I know the feeling.
He sure wasn't meeting that old girlfriend, Mary.
He meets Mary. You're quite right. My gosh, you're up on the subject. He meets his old girlfriend, whom he nearly married when his first wife died in the White House. And he had made the mistake of writing quite a few letters to this lady. She had had 2 husbands, and she was then divorced with a no-good son whom she was supporting. And Wilson sees her for the last time in the hotel in L.A. where he was staying with Mrs. Wilson, the second Mrs. Wilson, a very large woman called Edith Bowling Galt.
We're both sitting up straight and mentioning her name.
Well,
yes.
Automatically I start beginning to look like one of those people from that period. And it's rather a moving scene. That the great debates, did they have a sexual affair, Woodrow Wilson, or not? I mean, the idea of President Wilson having an affair is such a downer. I am not into presidential porn. But the fact that he had a deep relationship, he certainly did. Unlike Warren Harding, who ended up, he was elected president in 1920, and he had a child by a beautiful girl from Marion, Ohio, which was his hometown, where he was publisher of a newspaper, Nan. And Nan decided to come and keep visiting him. So Harding had to use one of the Secret Service men to go and make arrangements for Nan to come to the White House. Now the Duchess, Mrs. Harding, knew all about this, and she had her spies out to make sure that Warren, as she called him, wasn't up to any badness. So on one occasion, there was no place for him to take Nan. This was on a Sunday. She came in, the Secret Service got her into the famed Oval Office, and he had this dog, Laddie, a very nice big dog, devoted to one another. So finally, they find a place in which to make love, which is a downstairs closet that goes into the Rose Garden from the Oval Office presidency. So they are making the earth shake, as Ernest Hemingway would say, inside this closet.
Move.
The earth moves. The earth moves. Yeah. And suddenly Laddie, a very comforting dog, comes and sits outside of his master's door. Now, everybody knows that wherever the president goes, Laddie goes. And suddenly there is Mrs. Warren Harding, and she sees Laddie, and she sees the shut door. Tune in next week at this time, and you will know what Mrs. Harding saw.
And Gore, we're going to take a short pause. When we come back, I'd like you to pursue a little why the title Hollywood. I see it one way. I'm curious to see if the author meant it that way. We'll be back with Gore Vidal, author of Hollywood, a novel of America in the 1920s.
We've made real progress in the treatment of cancer in recent years. More importantly, we now know that up to 60% of cancers could be prevented altogether by doing things like avoiding excessive sunlight exposure, by cutting out cigarettes, and by not overeating, and following a diet high in fiber and low in fat. And I don't know about you, but I'd sure rather have to cut out a little here and there than in here.
The battle isn't over, but we are winning. Please support the American Cancer Society.
In a time of need, what type of person will each one of us be? Will we stare a problem in the face, or will we pretend it doesn't exist? Today, we're being put to the test with the AIDS crisis. AIDS affects men, women, and children. Eventually, we may all know someone touched by this disease. We believe AIDS can be prevented, unless we choose to look away. AIDS. Fight the fear with the facts.
Welcome back, Gore Vidal, Hollywood. Gore, before the break, I said, why the title Hollywood from your point of view?
Because it's really, that is, as they say in English class, the overarching metaphor, but we will get out of class immediately. The whole thing is about, in the previous book, there's 6 of these novels, and they comprise one long novel, which I have now completed. The one before it is The Power of the Press, William Randolph Hearst, which changes everything. This time I began thinking, well, I'm continuing the story of the First World War, and we step onto the world stage as a great power. We get the money power of the world accrues to us, and we're number 1 at the end of it. About a fraction of the way into the story, I realized that the only thing that the United States will ever be remembered for is Hollywood, is the invention of the movies and the sort of movies we invented and the distribution of the movies, and specifically the silent movies, which conquered the world. Well, then I realized, now is this going to be arbitrary? I'm just going to cut back and forth between politics in Washington and movie making in Hollywood. And then I realized that the two were linked. That with the First World War, Washington desperately needed Hollywood to propagandize, to make the people want to fight the Germans and not fight the English. Mm-hmm. And they also needed to raise money. We didn't have any money.
Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. were the first war bond
salespersons, and they came to New York. They called them Liberty Bonds, and they financed the First World War. They sold something like $50 million worth of bonds in 1 hour in Wall Street. Hollywood wakes up to this. Washington wakes up to this. Hollywood, the strumpet on the West Coast that they had disdained, they realize is a great power. So much so that Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law, McAdoo, when he sees that he can't be president in 1920, comes out here to Hollywood to help Douglas Fairbanks and Chaplin and Mary Pickford start United Artists. He put it all together. So all the way through, what I am writing here is the marriage between Washington, D.C. and power, and Hollywood, the movies, which makes the dreams.
And yet, it is interesting as you read the book, the most colorful characters are Theodore Roosevelt, who wants to raise, like Teddy's Rough Riders for World War I, and Woodrow Wilson outmaneuvers him.
Well, Theodore Roosevelt is, I think, Connie, we can tell your audience something that no one else has ever told them before. Movie stars are very boring by and large, and have nothing much to say.
Yes.
Politicians are like that now because they are treated like movie stars, and they're just moved around a sound studio and painted up, and they stare and say, we're standing tall here, a shining city on a hill. They do that now, but in real life, I mean, anybody, Chaplin was an interesting man, but between talking to Douglas Fairbanks, who was strenuous, and Theodore Roosevelt, you would flock to Theodore Roosevelt. He was just glittering. Fairbanks was waiting for the script.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt to the second power.
Oh, yes, and there I have a lot of them and their marital problems, and it was during that time that she caught him with her secretary, Lucy Mercer, and they made the famous treaty, you know, that she would stay with him, but not only would sex be out, but he would not betray her with Lucy again. Eleanor was bright enough not to say, you know, you can't do anything, but don't see Lucy.
Listen, I have to say, you did say earlier that something about the gift of pornography, etc. There's a scene with your character, Blaise, in France that is not, it could be considered one step closer. He's a very interesting, sensual human.
Well, Blaise is the half-brother of Caroline, and they own the Washington Herald. And he is rather surprising to me, because these characters, I don't know much about them until I start to write them, and then I see he's bisexual. And he ends up in, there was a bordello for gentlemen that provided young men, which had been financed by Marcel Proust. And Proust had put, an old friend of his, a former footman, servant, very superior sort of man, and had found this little hotel, which she turned over to him, and then they'd provide boys there, and the rich people, men would come. And I don't think I may be in the book. There's one detail that Proust's mother, whom he adored, had just died. He took all of her old furniture and put it in the whorehouse. Very sentimental.
Okay, Gore, you have run for office, but you say in the book that a good politician has the gift of instant intimacy. Was that lacking in you as a politician?
Well, I got an awful lot of votes, so something must have been instant.
Then you feel you do have that?
No, what I did not have was instant money in order to buy TV commercials, which is what determines the elections. As far as the face-to-face encounters with the voters, after all, I got 500,000 votes and spent no money at all.
So you did not have, as Jess Unruh said, mother's milk?
Did not have mother's milk. I could have used my own money, but I think that's cheating. And I certainly don't have $20 million, which it would have cost to get a seat for the Senate in California.
Within this book are the seeds for some of the ills we have today. The work that Harding had done, I mean, who is it, Doherty, the colonel?
Yeah, Doherty.
And also with what happens to poor Jess. People who are forced to kill themselves because the chief, in a sense, will be besmirched if the truth comes out.
Well, that happens all the time. Admiral Poindexter is already making the same sort of noises that were made in the Harding administration. Well, you always cover for your commander in a war, but when the war is over, is what the Poindexter is saying, you don't have to cover for him anymore. Yes, a lot of people get sacrificed, particularly when the government starts to go out of bounds, to go beyond its mandate, which Harding himself didn't, but some of his underlings did. And poor Jess ends by killing himself, or was he murdered? It's funny, in Hollywood I have 2 murder mysteries. One is sort of solved. In other words, I think I've got the right answer to that one. The one in Hollywood. The one in Washington I don't know. Because there's Jess Smith. He's the right-hand man of the Attorney General Dougherty. He's staying in Dougherty's flat in the Warman Park Hotel. He's been told to get out of town because trouble's coming. He knows too much. The Attorney General sends over his assistant to spend the night there because Jess can't sleep alone. Jess burns all his papers, appears to shoot himself, though he's right-handed. It's the left hand shot.
Yeah, it's the Duchess who says that. Yeah.
And downstairs is the head of the FBI, Mr. Burns, who then comes upstairs and takes the gun and says he loses it.
All part of what makes Hollywood a fascinating story, and I look forward to the next continuing saga of America, probably into the cable television world. Gore, will you autograph my book? If you'd like a copy of our publication, Good Books, write to me, Connie Martinson, P.O. Box 691640, Los Angeles, California at 90069. Look for our column in Beverly Hills today and online at the movies. We'll tell you about some other books we've liked. Support your local library. Go in, take out a card. That's how they get funding. And reading is fundamental, helps children learn to collect books. We'll see you next week. Gore, thank you very much.